Hey, so we're back and talking about history and on the track of explaining those four different nations that I talked to you about. So I'm going to start in the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty that was ruled in China, the last imperial dynasty. But I want to tell you that China in the 1300s to the present has been producing some products that the world has always desired. This is tea. And I'll be biased and say that Chinese tea is the best in the world, very much desired by tea addicts. Silk was a technology for making cloth that only China and Japan had in ancient times, and that silk is incredibly useful and beautiful, but also one of the best fabrics for various industrial uses because of its warmth and its strength. And then you might recognize that the style of work here, but what's actually important is the material in this vase. This kind of clay that makes what we call china is really special, very, very fine, very, very light colored, and better for making pots than any other clay in the world and only available in China. So China has always had things that the world wanted, but China has historically not really wanted to have very much to do with the world outside of Asia. And so this picture is from 1793 and shows the British government of the time. So you'll recognize here the British who are in the middle of their industrial revolution, traveling to China with offers of a trade deal, showing off some of the things that they have learned to make in their factories, like clocks and stuff like that, and trying to entertain the leaders of the Qing dynasty into a trade agreement. You can tell this picture is made by the British because it portrays the Chinese in a very stereotypical way, but you can see the artist is not actually feeling so much better about the British either. In the end of result of this was that the Chinese just didn't really want anything that the British had, and they refused to trade with the British on the basis of an exchange for industrial goods. They decided to allow the British to trade in China, but only for cash, so only for gold and silver. And that meant that the British were sinking all of their reserves of gold and silver into their things they were buying from China, not something they wanted to have happen, and putting pressure on the gold and silver market around the world, which had effects in Mexico and the United States that we'll learn about later. So the British came up with this strategy for dealing with the Chinese, and it was to get Chinese people addicted to a drug. Yep, British imperialism is really built on trading in drugs. The drug that they decided to trade in China is opium, which comes from a flower, which they were growing in places like Burma and Afghanistan. And the British sold it cheap and then got people addicted. And then they had a lock on something that they could trade for Chinese goods. This is a picture of people smoking opium, which is the oldest way of consuming it. We now have, highly refined versions of opium, which you'll recognize as heroin, and also we use refined versions of opium in hospital settings for painkillers. But it's a very addictive drug, and it really ruins the life of a person who's addicted to it. So the Chinese government was very upset about this, and it was hurting the economy and hurting the family life of people in China. So they argued that the British needed to stop this trade and that they would force them to do so. The British said, bring it. And so there was a series of wars called the Opium Wars. And because the British had an industrial fleet and the Chinese did not, and, steam-powered boats and other kinds of equipment, and the Chinese did not, the British won the Opium Wars and forced the Chinese into a long-term trade agreement. This brought on a wave of imperialism from countries all around the world that saw China's weakness and took advantage. So you have here, the British, the Germans, the Russians. This is a very stereotyped cartoon, which is what cartoonists do. The Japanese, the Americans, portrayed here by the goddess Columbia, all taking their piece of China. What that looked like in terms of imperialism was that each nation that imperialized China sort of took control of a specific small area from which they would conduct trade on terms of their own choosing, which meant that the Chinese government could not define the terms of trade at all. And that was damaging, as you might imagine, to the government in terms of their relationship with their own people at home, and also in terms of the government finances. So the Qing dynasty rapidly went downhill and began to lose control over China. The second to last leader of the Qing dynasty, Empress Cixi, struggled to maintain power, killed off most of her relatives in the process. And the result was that when she died in 1908, the only person who was there to inherit her imperial rule was a 2-year-old named Puyi. The 2-year-old emperor's managers struggled to maintain power, but eventually conceded it. And in 1911, China became a republic, led in title only by a man named Sun Yat-sen, in English called Sun Yat-sen, and his wife Sun Qingling, who later went on to become the president of the People's Republic of China. So Sun Yat-sen had an idea about making China into a democracy and about building a democratic republic. But in fact, the chaos that ended the Qing dynasty was so extreme that his government could never really get any kind of control over China. Sun Yat-sen had two sort of sub-lieutenants, if you want to call it, folks that he relied on in his organization, and they each had their own political organization. So Jiang Jieshi was the leader of the Nationalist Party, what's called in English the Nationalist Party, and in English his name is called Chiang Kai-shek. General Jiang led this group in cooperation with Sun Yat-sen and another political organization that was headed by Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, which was called the Communist Party in English. And they worked together for a long time to try, after Sun Yat-sen's early death, to try to turn China into a democratic republic, but eventually became enemies of each other and began a civil war between the two political parties, the nationalists and the communists. Then World War II happened, and the Japanese invaded China. And that actually gave advantage to the communists, who were deep inland in their civil war with the nationalists. The nationalists took the brunt of the Japanese assault, which was brutal, as you can see here. By the time that World War II was over and the Chinese were victors, the Communist Party was the stronger of the two remaining parties. And so the Communist Party took over mainland China in 1949. And the Nationalist Party, under the leadership of Jiang Jieshi, moved to Taiwan and created a separate government. So for a long time, the idea was that Taiwan was the capital of China, according to Jiang Jieshi, and Beijing was the capital of China, according to Mao Zedong. In more recent times, the people of Taiwan have become committed to an idea of just becoming an independent nation and not trying to retake the mainland. But the mainland still insists that Taiwan is part of their country and that they may try to take it at their option. This means that the Taiwan Strait here, this little bit of ocean between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, is very militarized. Hong Kong was given to the British as part of the British conquering of China in the Opium Wars, and so was an independent British-controlled colony up until 1999, and then became sort of a part of mainland China, under the idea that it would be ruled separately but part of mainland China. This is very much in dispute. And that is the reason for so many protests and struggles in Hong Kong right now, which we'll study in greater depth. Tibet has been part of mainland China for thousands of years, but before the 1949 and the takeover of the Communist Party, that relationship was really on paper only. Tibet was self-governed. It had its own culture, its own language, its own national structure, and simply paid tribute to Chinese emperors for the privilege of not having to deal with them. And was generally left alone. But beginning in 1949, the People's Republic of China tried to have much greater control over Tibet, and this resulted in a struggle for independence on the part of the Tibetans, many of whom have moved to India as refugees. And so we'll study that conflict a little bit more at the end of this unit. So there's your quick and dirty 100, 200 years of history.